It was a chilly October evening in my Boston suburb home, the kind where the leaves glow red under the streetlights and the air smells faintly of wood smoke. I'd spent all day preparing for this dinner: roast chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, a crisp apple pie cooling on the counter. The dining room table was set with my mother's old china, the one I only bring out for special occasions. My daughter Laura and her husband Ethan were coming over, along with a few of Laura's colleagues from her office job downtown. I'm Helen, 66 years old, and I've always believed a good meal can mend almost anything. But that night taught me some things can't be fixed with pie at exactly 7:30. Ethan raised his wine glass, the candlelight catching the edges of his expensive watch. He cleared his throat, commanding the room like he always did, with that smug grin I'd learned to tolerate. "Everyone," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place mockery. "Maybe. I'd like to propose a toast to my dear mother-in-law Helen, who just shared the delightful news that she's retired. Again. For health reasons, of course." He paused, making air quotes with his free hand, his eyes locked on mine. "Helen, tell us, how does it feel to be a failure at your age?" The room went still. Laura's colleagues stared at their plates, forks frozen mid-bite. My daughter's face flushed red, her eyes darting between me and her husband. I felt the sting of his words, sharp as a winter wind, cutting deeper because they came in my own home, in front of people I barely knew. I'm no stranger to hard dice. Was a chief accountant for 30 years, crunching numbers through recessions and audits. But this was personal. I set my glass down, slow and deliberate, my hands steady despite the heat rising in my chest. I looked at Ethan, his grin still plastered on, waiting for me to crumble. But I didn't. I smiled, just a small one, the kind that says, "You have no idea what's coming." Because, you see, I'd been holding on to a truth that was about to change. Everything. And Ethan. He was about to learn that underestimating me was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. That moment at the dinner table, with Ethan's cruel words hanging in the air like smoke, felt like it stretched forever. His smirk, the way he leaned back in his chair, so sure he'd humiliated me in my own home, it lit something inside me. Not anger, not yet. It was resolve. I've spent 30 years balancing books, catching errors that could sink companies, and I've learned one thing: numbers don't lie, and neither does truth. So I leaned forward, my voice calm as a summer morning, and looked Ethan dead in the eye. "Ethan," I said, slow and deliberate, "I imagine being a failure feels a lot like learning the house you've been calling hours on your fancy Instagram posts. Isn't yours at all." I paused, letting the words sink in. The table was so quiet you could hear the candles flickering. "Because as of tomorrow, you and Laura have 30 days to find a new place to live." Ethan's smirk vanished faster. Then a dropped glass. His face went pale like he'd seen a ghost. "What are you talking about, Helen?" he stammered, his voice cracking just enough to betray him. I smiled. The same kind of smile he'd flashed at me moments ago, all sharp, edges and certainty. "This house," I said, gesturing to the dining room. "The walls I'd painted myself, the hardwood floors I'd saved for years to install, belongs to me. Not you, not Laura, just me." Laura's fork clattered against her plate. What?" she whispered, her eyes wide with confusion. I hated that look on her face. But this wasn't about her, not yet. This was about Ethan, who'd spent 3 years treating my home like his personal kingdom. "Oh, sweetheart," I said to Laura, keeping my tone gentle. "Didn't Ethan tell you? When you two couldn't get a mortgage because of his startup? Debts. I bought this house. Cash. Your names aren't on the deed. They never were." The room stayed silent, but I could feel the shift. Laura's colleagues, who'd been pretending to study their mashed potatoes, were now sneaking glances at Ethan, whose jaw was working like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. Nobody at that table liked him much. His habit of bragging about his tech empire while barely paying his bills hadn't won him any fans. I saw a few smirks, quickly hidden behind wine glasses. "Helen, you can't just kick us out," Ethan finally managed, his voice tight with panic. "Oh, I can," I said, standing up and smoothing my sweater. "It's called being a landlord, dear. Look it up." I gathered my purse and scarf, my heart steady despite the storm I'd just unleashed. "Thank you all for a lovely evening," I said to the table. "Laura, we'll talk tomorrow." "Ethan, I'd start browsing apartment listings. Boston's rental market is brutal this time of year." And with that, I walked out of my dining room, leaving behind a man who'd just learned that words have consequences, and I wasn't the failure he thought I was. The next morning, I sat in my sunroom with a mug of black coffee, the kind that's strong enough to wake you up and remind you you're still alive. The Boston sun was just peeking through, the frost on the windows casting a soft glow on the newspaper I hadn't opened yet. I was waiting for the phone to ring, for the conversation I knew was coming. And right on cue at 7:15 sharp, it did. Laura's name flashed on the screen, and I braced myself. "Mom, what the hell happened last night?" Laura's voice was raw, like she'd been up all night arguing with Ethan. I could picture her pacing the kitchen of my house, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, the way she always did when she was stressed. "Language, sweetheart," I said, keeping my tone even though my heart ached for her. "I think you know exactly what happened. Your husband decided to humiliate me in front of a room full of strangers. So I reminded him where he stands." "Can't just kick us out of our home," she said, her voice cracking. I set my coffee down, the ceramic clinking softly against the table. "It's not your home, Laura. It never was." I let that sit for a moment, giving her time to process. "Do you remember 3 years ago? You and Ethan were so excited about that little brownstone on Chestnut Street. But the bank wouldn't approve your mortgage because of his startup debts piling up." There was silence on the other end, heavy and thick. I went on, my voice steady but soft, like I was guiding her through a memory she'd rather forget. "You were crushed. Ethan was furious, blaming everyone but himself, and I stepped in. I told you I'd figure something out, but I didn't. Cosign a loan, Laura. I bought this house outright. $450,000 from the savings your father and I built over decades. What you've been paying me every month. That's rent. Not a mortgage, rent." "Why didn't you tell us?" Laura's voice was small now, almost childlike. I could hear the hurt, the confusion, and it broke my heart a little. "Because I wanted you to feel like you were building something," I said. "I wanted you to have pride, to feel like you were standing on your own. Your father and I always said we'd help you kids without making you feel helpless." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "But pride isn't something you can borrow, Laura. It's earned. And respect. That's non-negotiable." She was quiet for a long moment. I could almost hear her mind racing, piecing together the last 3 years. "Ethan says you're being cruel," she finally said. "He says you're punishing us for one stupid comment." I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me, sharp and dry. "Ethan says a lot of things, sweetheart. Most of them are about as honest as his startup's balance sheets." I softened my tone because this wasn't about hurting her. This isn't about one comment. It's about respect. It's about your husband thinking it's okay to call your 66-year-old mother a failure in her own dining room. Another pause, longer this time. When Laura spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "What do you want us to do?" I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the garden where I'd planted roses after my husband passed. "I want you to find your own place," I said. "Get your own mortgage. Build a life that doesn't depend on me being your safety net while Ethan walks all over me. I love you, Laura, always will. But I won't be a doormat in my own house for a man who's never worked an honest day in his life." I hung up after that, my heart heavy, but my resolve firm. 30 days, that's what they had. And I had a feeling Ethan's troubles were just beginning. 2 days after that dinner, Ethan showed up at my doorstep holding a box of artisanal chocolates, like it was some kind of peace offering. I opened the door, my gray cardigan wrapped tight against the Boston chill. And there he was, all polished charm and fake remorse. His smile was the kind you see on used car salesmen, too wide and too practiced. "Helen," he said, holding out the chocolates, "I owe you an apology. I was way out of line the other night." I took the box, set it on the hall table without a word, and motioned for him to come inside. "By all means, Ethan," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "Make yourself comfortable in my house." He flinched at that just a little and followed me into the kitchen. I could tell he was nervous. His hands kept fidgeting with the cuffs of his designer jacket. Good, he should be. I leaned against the counter, folding my arms. "So let's hear it. Your apology." Ethan cleared his throat, launching into a rehearsed speech about stress and his startup struggles, how the holidays were tough, how he didn't mean to offend me. It was all so polished, so predictable. I let him talk, watching the way his eyes darted around, avoiding mine. 30 years as a chief accountant taught me one thing. People who lie always give themselves away. Stress is a funny thing. "Ethan," I said when he finally stopped. "It makes people say what they really think. It's like calling me a failure in front of a room full of people." I raised an eyebrow, letting that sink in. "But I'm more curious about something else. Your startup. The one that's been struggling for years, according to Laura. The one you've poured thousands into, right?" Ethan shifted in his seat, his sneakers squeaking against my hardwood floor. "What's that got to do with anything?" he asked, his voice tighter now. I smiled, slow and deliberate, the way I used to when I caught a client fudging their books. "Humor me," I said. "How much have you and Laura invested in this venture of yours? Ballpark." He hesitated, his jaw working like he was chewing on a lie. "Maybe 20 grand, he mumbled. "Equipment, marketing, the usual." I nodded, like I was impressed. 20 grand for a startup that's never turned a profit, while you're living rent-free in a house worth $500,000? I let that hang in the air, watching his face go pale. "Ethan," I said, my voice dropping low, "do you know what I did for 30 years? I wasn't just a bookkeeper, specializing in spotting fraud. It's people who thought they could hide money from the IRS, from their partners, from their families. So when you tell me your startup's failing, but I see you driving a leased BMW and posting about client meetings at fancy restaurants, I get curious." His eyes widened, just a fraction, but I saw it. I walked to the stove, filling the kettle with water, my movements calm and deliberate. I did a little digging, I continued. "Your startup's financials, a mess. But those consulting fees you've been funneling into a separate account? The ones you haven't reported to the IRS? Those are interesting." Ethan's hands were shaking now, the chocolates long forgotten. "You're making this up," he said, but his voice was weak, like a man who knew he was caught. "Am I?" I turned to face him, leaning against the counter. "Your business account shows transfers to a personal account in Laura's name, but she doesn't know about it, does she? You've been skimming money from your so-called investors, Ethan. Cash payments, off the books. How much? 10,000? 20? "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but his face told a different story. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his eyes darted to the door like he was planning an escape. I poured hot water into a teapot, the steam rising between us. "Here's the thing," I said, my voice steady as steel. "I'm not some helpless old woman you can push around. I'm not your meal ticket, and I'm definitely not your fool. If you ever speak to me like you did at that dinner again, I won't just kick you out of my house. I'll send every scrap of evidence I have to the IRS. And trust me, Ethan, I have plenty." He sat there, frozen in my kitchen chair, his charm crumbling like cheap plaster. "You wouldn't," he whispered. I smiled, pouring tea into 2 cups, the domestic gesture at odds with the fire in my words. "Try me." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of his mistakes. I sipped my tea, letting him stew in it. Ethan thought he could play me, but he was about to learn that I'd been playing the game longer and better than he ever would. The days after my showdown with Ethan were quiet, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of quiet that feels like the air before a storm, heavy with something you can't quite name. I kept busy in my garden, pruning the last of the autumn roses, trying to shake the unease that lingered after our talk. Ethan's shaky denial, the way his eyes darted to the door, it stuck with me. I'd spent 30 years spotting lies in balance sheets, and I knew he was hiding more than just unreported income. Oh, I just didn't know how much more. Not yet. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was sipping tea with my neighbor Clara, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email, forwarded by mistake from an old colleague of Ethan's, someone he'd worked with on his startup. The subject line was blank, but the message, oh, it was a bombshell. Looking forward to tonight, it read, Laura's stuck at the office late again, and the old lady's probably knitting by 8. House is all ours. Wear that jacket I like, Claire. My heart stopped. Claire, not a client, not a business partner, but Claire, the woman Ethan had been raving about as the genius behind his startup's new app. Clara peered over my shoulder, her glasses slipping down her nose. Well, now, she said, her voice dry as autumn leaves. That's not the kind of email you send to a colleague. I didn't say anything. I just sat there staring at the screen, feeling a mix of fury and heartbreak, not for me, but for Laura, my sweet Laura, who'd been working late nights to keep their bills paid while Ethan played house with someone else. I screenshotted the email, my hand steady despite the fire in my chest. Then I typed a reply, short and sharp. Ethan, I think you meant to send this to someone else. Be more careful next time. His response came in seconds, a frantic jumble of words, Helen. Oh God, it's not what you think. Kai can explain. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I just told him to come to the house. Now, 20 minutes later, Ethan burst through my front door, his face flushed, his hair a mess like he'd run the whole way from his office. Helen, please, he said, his voice high and desperate. You don't understand. It's not what it looks like. I set my phone on the coffee table, the screenshot glowing like evidence in a courtroom. It's exactly what it looks like, I said, my voice low, every inch of my 5'5" frame burning with anger. You're cheating on my daughter, in my house, while she's working double shifts to support your failing startup. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it like a fish gasping for air. How long? I asked, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. He looked away, his shoulder slumping. 6 months, he whispered. 6 months. 6 months of lies, of sneaking around, of betraying Laura while she trusted him. Who is she? I pressed. Claire, he said, barely audible. Claire Thompson. She's helping with the startup. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Helping with the startup, sure. But that wasn't the worst of it. That email was just the crack in the dam. The real flood came later that day when I called an old friend from my accounting days, Susan, who still worked at a financial firm downtown. I asked her to do a little digging on Ethan's business dealings, nothing formal, just a favor between old colleagues. What she found made my blood run cold. Ethan wasn't just cheating on Laura with Claire. He was planning to leave her, but not before siphoning off everything he could. Susan found transfers thousands of dollars moving from Laura and Ethan's joint account to an offshore account in Claire's name. He was setting up a new life, one where Laura wasn't included. And then came the twist, the one that hit me like a punch to the gut. Susan uncovered a Documenta forged investment contract with Laura's signature, dated just last month. It tied Laura to a deal that would have given Ethan access to my retirement savings, the nest egg I'd built over decades with my late husband. Nearly $500,000, meant to secure my future, was within Ethan's grasp, all because He'd faked Laura's signature to make it look like she'd approved the deal. I sat in my living room staring at the documents. Susan emailed me, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with rage. Ethan wasn't just a liar or a cheat. He was a thief trying to steal not just from Laura, but from me, the woman he'd called. A failure in front of a room full of people. I looked at the forged signature, so close to Laura's, but just a little off sloppy. Like Ethan's whole plan, I called Laura that evening, my voice softer than it had been with Ethan. "Sweetheart," I said, "we need to talk. Bring your laptop and any bank statements you have." She arrived an hour later, her eyes red from crying, already suspecting something was wrong. I showed her the email, the transfers, the forged contract. She sat there, silent, her hands clutching the papers like they were the last pieces of her. "Marriage, he was going to take everything," she whispered. "Not just from me, from you." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "He didn't, Laura, and he won't, because we're not the kind of women who let men like Ethan win." That night, as Laura slept in her old childhood bedroom, I sat up, planning my next move. Ethan thought he could play us both, but he'd underestimated me. And soon, he'd learn that betraying my family was the last mistake he'd ever make in my house. The fallout from Ethan's betrayal settled over my house like a heavy fog. Laura was still reeling, sleeping in her old bedroom, her eyes hollow, from the weight of what she'd learned. I kept busy watering my roses, brewing tea, anything to keep my hands moving while my mind worked through what came next. I knew Ethan wouldn't go quietly. Men like him never do. They cling to their lies like life rafts, and when that fails, they call in reinforcements. I was right. 3 days after I showed Laura the forged contract, a sleek black Mercedes pulled into my driveway. I watched from my kitchen window as Ethan's parents, Richard and Evelyn, stepped out, followed by a man in a tailored suit clutching a leather briefcase. The lawyer, no doubt. Richard, with his silver hair and air of old money, looked at my modest ranch house like it was beneath him. Evelyn, draped in a cashmere coat, had the same haughty expression Ethan wore at that dinner. I wasn't surprised. Arrogance, it seems, runs in the family. The doorbell rang at 10 sharp. I opened the door, my cardigan buttoned up, my face calm but ready. "Helen," Richard said, his voice smooth as a politician's. "This is Charles Warner, our attorney. We need to discuss this situation." I smiled just enough to be polite. "Course," I said, stepping aside. "Come in, let's be reasonable." But inside, I was braced for a fight. 30 years of balancing books and dodging corporate lawyers had taught me one thing. Never let them see you sweat. We sat in my living room, the lawyer's briefcase open on my coffee table like a declaration of war. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped, playing the part of the concerned father. "Helen, this eviction nonsense has gone too far," he said. "Ethan and Laura have lived here for 3 years. They've contributed to this household, improved it. They have rights." Evelyn nodded, her pearls catching the light. "Ethan's been managing repairs, coordinating contractors. Making this place a home," she added, her tone dripping with condescension. I almost laughed. Managing repairs? The only thing Ethan managed was his Instagram aesthetic. But I kept my face neutral, sipping my tea. "Interesting theory," I said, my voice light. "Tell me, Evelyn, what exactly has Ethan contributed? Financially? I mean, the room went quiet." Richard's confident smile faltered, just a fraction. "Well," he said, "they've been maintaining the property, investing their time and energy." I set my cup down, the clink loud in the silence. "With whose money?" I asked, my eyes moving from Richard to Evelyn. "Every repair, every contractor, every new coat of paint on these walls. I paid for it. Every cent Ethan and Laura have. Been living here rent-free, calling it rent, but it's my money that's kept this house standing." Charles, the lawyer, cleared his throat, pulling out a stack of documents. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice all business, "Ethan and Laura have been acting as family members, not tenants. Their contributions could be seen as sweat equity, potentially giving them a claim to partial ownership under certain legal precedents. It was a good bluff. I'll give him that. Okay. The kind of legal jargon that scares most people into backing down, but I wasn't most people. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. That's a fascinating angle, Charles, I said, my tone pleasant as a Sunday brunch. But adverse possession requires open, hostile occupation without permission. Ethan and Laura have been here with my consent, paying rent informal, sure, but documented. I walked to my desk, pulling out a folder I'd prepared after that dinner. 3 years of bank records, I said, handing it to Charles. 36 checks, made out to Helen Thompson, with rent written in the memo line. All deposited. Into my account, their tenants, nothing more. The lawyer's face didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten as he flipped through the pages. Richard and Evelyn exchanged a glance, their confidence cracking like thin ice. There's more, I said, my voice still calm, but edged with steel. I've been in touch with a friend at the IRS about Ethan's creative accounting, those unreported consulting fees, the offshore account he's been funneling money into. I'm sure they'd love to take a closer look. Evelyn's hand flew to her pearls, her face paling. What are you implying? She asked, her voice sharp. I smiled, the kind of smile that says you've already lost. I'm not implying anything, I said. I'm stating facts. Ethan's been hiding income, forging documents, and trying to scam his way into my retirement savings. If you want to talk about rights, let's talk about Mina as a landlord. And as a mother who won't let her daughter be manipulated by a con artist. Charles closed his briefcase with a snap. This conversation is over, he said, standing. Up Richard and Evelyn followed, their faces a mix of shock and fury. 23 days, I called after them as they headed for the door. That's how long Ethan and Laura have left. Don't waste it. As their car pulled away, I stood in my doorway, the autumn air cool against my face. I'd won this round, but I knew Ethan wasn't done. Men like him always have one more trick up their sleeve. And I was ready for it. The days after Ethan's parents left my house felt like the calm before a hurricane. Laura was still staying with me, her suitcase tucked in the corner of her old bedroom, her face a mix of heartbreak and disbelief. I kept my routine morning coffee, pruning my roses, checking my email, but my mind was racing. Ethan's lies, his forged contract, his affair with Claire. It was all bad, but something told me there was more. My years as a chief accountant had taught me to trust my gut when the numbers didn't add up. And Ethan. He wasn't adding up at all then. On a crisp Thursday morning, I got a call that changed everything. It was a private investigator named Rachel Carter, her voice steady but urgent over the phone. Mrs. Thompson, she said, I've been hired by another family looking into Ethan Hayes. I understand you might have information about his activities. My heart skipped a beat. Another family. I invited her over, my hands trembling as I set out a fresh pot of tea. Rachel arrived at noon, her briefcase stuffed with files that told a story far uglier than I'd imagined. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, her eyes kind but serious. Ethan isn't just cheating on your daughter, she said, spreading out documents like a deck of cards. He's a professional. He's been targeting families like yours for years. Wealthy widows with adult children, people with assets he can manipulate. I stared at the papers, my stomach twisting. What do you mean targeting? I asked, though I already dreaded. The answer. Rachel laid it out, piece by devastating piece. Ethan had a pattern. He'd charm his way into families, usually through a romantic relationship with a son or daughter, then work his way into their finances. He'd done it to at least 6 other families across Massachusetts and New York, siphoning off over $1.8 million through fake investments, forged signatures, and offshore accounts. My family, Laura and I, were just his latest mark. He researched you, Rachel said, her voice low. Your savings, your house, your late husband's estate. He planned his marriage to Laura to get access to your wealth. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Every moment of Ethan's charm, his smiles, his promises to Laurette was all a lie calculated from the start. I thought of my daughter, trusting him, loving him, while he played her like a pawn in a game I didn't even know we were in. "There's more," Rachel said, sliding a document across the table. "He's facing charges: fraud, money laundering, forgery. The FBI's been building a case, and your evidence the forged contract. The offshore transfers has sealed it." That evening, I sat Laura down in my living room, the same room where Ethan had tried to charm his way out of trouble. I told her everything: Rachel's findings, the other families, the calculated way Ethan had targeted us. Laura listened in silence, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. When I finished, she stared at the floor, her voice barely a whisper. "Nothing was real," she said. 3 years of my life, our marriage, it was all a con. I reached for her hand, my heart breaking for her. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I said, "but this isn't your fault. He's a predator. You didn't fail, you were targeted." She looked up at me, her eyes wet but clearer than they'd been in days. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked. "Not all of it," I admitted, "but I knew he wasn't honest. And I wasn't going to let him hurt you any more than he already had." The next morning, I watched from my front window. As police cars pulled into my driveway, Ethan's face was a mask of shock as they cuffed him, his usual swagger gone, replaced by the cold realization that his game was over. Laura stood beside me, her shoulders squared, watching as the man who'd betrayed her was led away. 12 days left," she said quietly, referring to the eviction deadline. I squeezed her hand. "Take all the time you need," I said. "The house will be here when you're ready to figure out what's next." Months later, at Ethan's sentencing, the full scope of his crimes came to light. The prosecutor laid it out in a packed courtroom: 7 families, $1.8 million stolen, a trail of broken trust stretching across 2 states. Ethan sat there in an orange jumpsuit, his charm replaced by a blank stare. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, his accomplice Claire facing her own charges for aiding his schemes. Laura and I sat in the gallery listening as the judge called Ethan a calculated predator. It wasn't justice, not fully, but it was closure as we left the courtroom. Laura turned to me, her face softer, like a weight had lifted. "I'm going to be okay, Mom," she said. And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. 3 months after Ethan's sentencing, my house felt different. Not empty, but peaceful, like the quiet after a long storm. Laura had moved out, renting a small apartment across town, closer to her new job at a nonprofit downtown. I'd visit her sometimes, bringing homemade soup or a batch of cookies. And I'd see her smile starting to come back, tentative at first, but stronger every day. She was finding her way, rebuilding a life that was hers, not Ethan's. And me, I was right where I belonged, in my Boston home, surrounded by my roses and the memories of a life I'd fought hard to build. I'd sit in my sunroom most mornings, coffee in hand, watching the world wake up. The weight of those weeks, Ethan's betrayal, the forged contract, the truth about his scams still lingered. But it didn't define me. It taught me something, though. Something I hadn't fully understood until Ethan walked into my dining room and called me a failure. Kindness is a gift, but without boundaries, it's just a weakness. I'd spent years giving my home, my savings, my love, thinking it would protect Laura, but protecting the people you love sometimes means being ruthless with the ones who'd hurt them. Ethan taught me that. He thought he could walk all over me, a 66-year-old widow with a bad back and a knack for numbers. But he didn't count on me knowing my worth, knowing my strength. I'd spent 30 years catching liars and balance sheets, and I wasn't about to let one tear down my family. Laura learned something to that trust. Once broken, can't be glued back together, but it can be rebuilt within yourself. She's stronger now, not because of Ethan, but in spite of him. As for me, I'm still here, living my life, answering to no one but myself. My house is mine again. Not just in the deed, but in the quiet moments when I water my garden or read by the fireplace. It's a freedom I didn't know I'd been missing, and it's worth more than any dollar Ethan tried to steal. I think about Laura out there finding her own path, and I know she'll be okay. We both will, because sometimes the people who hurt us the most teach us the lessons we need the most. If you're listening to this, I hope you'll remember that your story matters. The moments when you felt small, when someone tried to dim your light, they don't define you. Standing up, setting boundaries, choosing yourself, that's what does. Share your story in the comments if you want. Tell me how you found your strength, how you rebuilt after someone tried to break you. And if you've got a minute, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this, about finding light in the dark. And I'd love for you to hear them. For now, I'm Helen, 66 years young, living in a house I fought for with a heart that's learned to guard what matters most. Thanks for listening.